would just say one last thing, take 30 seconds of your time?
Sure, of course.
Yeah, so basically, in the beginning of time, just human civilization was very primitive, and there was wars and there was fighting and there's terrible things going on. And through voluntary cooperation and capitalism, as in billions of people have been lifted out of poverty. And I think that's really, really important for people to realize. And as nations become very wealthy, the people at the top like to look around and sensationalize a few people at the bottom and use it to strong arm the electorate by promising free things and by running deficits and by doing really immoral things. So I want your listeners to realize that Bernie Sanders is probably the most immoral candidate running for president.
Fuck
in
yeah.
2020. And that's all I got.
Let me just ask you one more question, Colt. You're a millennial. Give me just your age range, just so I have a sense of like what we got going
28.
on. 28. And that's millennials for liberty or freedom? Which one was it?
Millennials meet liberty.
Okay. All right, Colt.
That's
well,
a
good
good
luck
title.
with your thing. And do not hesitate to call back in at some other time.
That's a clever name, legit. I like that. Can we find another
Yeah, it's
case
fun,
of
guys.
somebody
I
dying
really
from medical
appreciate it. Thank
debt
you very much.
so we can exploit them for the greater immoral? Does anybody have a story of a kid getting ripped off of their medication so we can sensationalize for immoral purposes? Thank you.
All right.
I think the surge
thanks,
in
Colt.
the numbers really started to change when we can find more immiserated people who really are.
Every dollar that I tax a high frequency trade and it's directed to education, I get off on the immorality.
I get off on the pure fucking immorality of it. That Wall Street money turned to a free college. It makes me hard. It's so sick. It's so wrong.
I'm trying to like look up. Jesus. All right.
And then you get rid of medical debt and you invest it in green jobs. You know how depraved that is?
I'm gonna be so bad.
We're going to be so
Now, hold on.
sick.
I should know this off the top of my head, but theft, the definition of theft is to steal something. The definition of stealing is to take without permission or legal right. Now, here's the problem. Here's the problem with Colt's perspective on this. Law is a function of government. It is a function of government. Law can only be enforced. It's not voluntary. It's law. You can either voluntarily comply with the law or not, but law is not voluntary. It is a law.
That's hilarious.
It means that
Yeah.
there will be consequences, legal consequences if you do it. The law is set up by government. If the government passes a law that says taxation is legal, guess what? It's legal. Now you could say it's immoral. You should not be able to set up a currency that you then disseminate and create value by taxing it. You could say that's immoral, and I don't know. It's a function of your system of morality.
Is there any way we could cover more people with health care?
But it's just a fact. It's just a fact. It's not theft. It is not theft. That is a fact. You can say that it's immoral for governments to pass laws that say you can tax. But that's, in my mind, silly, because if they didn't tax, then the money that you have in your pocket would be worthless.
All right. As Ben Burgis, this is Give Them an Argument. I am now joined. This is exciting because usually when I tell my wife Jennifer, who's going to be on the show, the names never mean anything to her, and they still didn't tonight. But I guess it's Sam Seder said, "Who's that?" And I said, "Well, he's the voice of Hugo on Bob's Burgers," and it's like, okay, that meant something to her. So, thank you so much for joining me, Sam.
My pleasure. It's a real pleasure to be here. And yes, it's the Hugo thing opens a lot more doors than my actual name. I can assure you. And it's it's a multi-generational thing too, actually.
How's that?
Well, my kid only cares that I'm Hugo. That's it. Everything
Fair
else is completely trivial to her.
Fair enough. Well, I do enjoy Bob's Burgers, but the reason that I wanted you on was to talk about your many debates with libertarians. That you were telling me before we started that you feel like they've the libertarians don't come as much as they used to. But you did quite a few of these, and.
Yes.
Obviously this is like right at the core of what we're interested in on this show, and I've done quite a bit, and in some cases with the same people, but I mean you have a particular way of doing these that's unique and fun to watch, and thought it might be interesting to watch a few of these together and to kind of talk about some of the bigger themes that emerge from them. Forrest, do we have the dependent or independent of government guy?
Let me say just first off, the fun thing for me when I watched just that clip that you started with is really watching Michael on some level, because when we would do the show, I'm in a mode where like more often than not, I'm not trying to like laugh and consume what we're doing. And so when I watch back on these things, I end up like, I think appreciating what Michael's doing more than I did in the moment, actually. And in certain situations. But,
no, I mean, I could see that. I mean, like there are so many of these things where he is, he's doing what he did, and you like, obviously, you don't want to you don't want to start cracking up for one thing. As far as what you're trying to do with the colors, you'll kind of ruin it if you started doing that.
Right.
So you're just sitting there, being completely straight faced, during stuff like the evil Bernie bit, or one of my all time favorites is the guy, the anarcho-capitalist caller, whose ultimate solution to potential problems caused by wealth inequality in his utopia was assassinations.
I mean, yeah,
it's,
if you sprinkle them around enough.
yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
And part of what makes that clip so golden is that Michael, since in his role that he could just do that, right, is just cracking up while this guy's talking, and he's getting offended by it. It's like, oh, what's he saying? And you're like, oh yeah, no, it's very disrespectful. Now about the assassination.
Yes, it's true.
All right, let's watch the clip.
I wanted to talk to you guys, ask you 3 questions, and you guys can pick the one. Hello? Yes. And you guys can pick the one that you find to be most juicy. They're not gotcha. They're very simple.
Okay.
The one is would you rather people be independent or dependent on the government? The second is, do you think that the Trump administration and Republicans generally don't want witnesses to be called in the impeachment trial? And the third is, would you prefer that people get in a position where they must contemplate an abortion or not get in that position in life? The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Blake. I would say that the question is silly. This is the first question. Do I want people independent or dependent of government? There is no one who lives in society that is independent of government. That is an impossibility. That's like saying, would you prefer people have can fly or not fly? Well, it doesn't matter, because you know what? We don't have wings. The reality is, can you tell me a person who lives in this country who is independent of the government?
I know a couple, yes.
Who?
They, Al and Sheila, I'm not going to say their last name, but they're close friends of mine.
And
they live in northwestern Arkansas.
They do?
Yes.
And
they live out in the middle of nowhere.
In the middle of nowhere?
They're completely solar. They have wells. obviously,
Where did they
I
get
knew
the
this would
solar
happen.
technology?
I knew this would.
Did they develop
What's
the
that?
solar technology?
No, they didn't.
What?
I knew
That's
this would
weird.
happen, and what I wanted from you guys was just a very simple answer. It's a very simple question. Like I said, it wasn't a got you.
No, well, like
Yes,
I say,
obviously government-
your question
Obviously, government exists.
is, Blake,
Obviously,
are
government
you married?
exists, and it has done things.
Blake, are you married?
No.
You're not married?
No.
You have a girlfriend, boyfriend?
Yes, girlfriend.
When did you stop beating her? It's a simple question.
Sam,
Just give me a date.
it's ridiculous.
Just give me a date. Simple question.
Jesus Christ.
All right, let me ask you this. I'll make it even simpler. Did you stop beating her?
Well,
Blake, this is a simple
ridiculous
question.
statement.
This is a question.
Yeah.
It's a simple question. Did you stop beating her?
You're assuming the presumption that I have before.
Ah,
That's not the
okay.
same- that's not-
And
that's not
now
the
I
same-
think
that's
we've
not
been
the
able to
same question.
illustrate my problem with your question, which is assumes that it's possible for people to live in this country when they're not, in some fashion,
I didn't say
dependent
it was-
upon government.
I didn't say it was possible or impossible. What I asked is,
Well, I
is it
didn't
better
say
if
whether you
people live
had.
independent?
I didn't say whether you had or had not
Or
beaten your
dependent
girlfriend.
upon
I'm
the
just
government.
asking if you stopped.
Like I said, that's a presumption. That's
Right.
an assumption
Right. Well,
that I
you're
did at one
presuming
point.
that being independent of government is
People-
possible.
People have.
Yeah.
I can't even remember any of these, but it was fun. It was fun to watch.
Yeah.
The-
That's yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is. I have to say that, like, I feel like there are people who probably see this and say, well, look, it's a self-selected group of people who
Sure.
call into a show. And, but there is a quality about libertarians that I think, in my experience, is not just a function of people called into the show. I interviewed we know what would happen if, I interviewed, Block. I can't even remember
Block,
the name of it. Yeah, Walter Block, who I was very nervous prior to interviewing him. Like, I was telling Michael, like, I gotta bone up on this stuff. This guy's a professor at I can't remember where he was at the time, but it was some like Koch endowed division of a school, but it was a legit school, and he was an advisor to Ron Paul, at least he claimed to be, and no reason to doubt him. And but across the board, they make these just sort of like assertions, or they are just caught up in honestly like the most basic of like logic games and stuff that you just get the sense that they've never been challenged by. It's every time I talk to a libertarian, it feels like, have you run this by anybody yet? Or you're just so convinced of what you're saying, and it doesn't feel like you have in any way had a conversation with someone who's inclined to disagree with what you're asserting.
Yeah, no, it is really interesting. Like at the end of the Evil Bernie clip we used as a cold open, like what you're going through is a really like basic, like actually two really basic objections to the idea that taxation is theft. Which like roughly, if all right, what does that mean, right? That they say, oh, that it's theft, that you're taking something that people are entitled to. Well, entitled to in what sense? Can't mean legally entitled, because the IRS is legally entitled to that share of your income. It can mean, morally entitled, but then like that gets like pretty circular. Like you say, well, it's morally wrong to take what it's morally wrong to take. It's like, okay, but what's morally wrong to take? And then the other is whether, the other objection, that you're running at the end is that you like wouldn't like this wealth that you have to tax in the first place, wouldn't be generated in the first place if not for the existence of taxation, which is the point that you're making with the dependent or independent guy in the clip that we just watched in a different way. And and whatever. I mean, like I don't I mean, I don't rule out that there could be libertarians, who have good answers, like somewhat plausible responses to these things. But it is remarkable how many of them don't see that coming, because those seem pretty basic.
Yeah, I find it stunning. It is just, I am continually amazed by libertarians who get stumped as soon as they start to enter into the real world in some way. There's a big boy in the plastic bubble quality. And I do mean boy.
Yeah, no, definitely boy. There's a this is something that that does that does clearly appeal more to guys, and you could speculate about why that is.
Yeah.
But it is also just really interesting on a really basic level, because so many of these guys like really fetishize like the rhetorical aura of like logic and argumentation, and like that's very important to them. Like going back to like Ayn Rand and people like that, like they were so in love with the idea of that. But yeah, you do often get this sense that they're mostly used to talking to each other, that they, like people who maybe share certain like really basic, intuitions about, taxation being wrong, and, and things like that. And oftentimes like just don't see it coming, like these sorts of basic replies, or maybe just kind of don't know like what people say who disagree with them about this.
Yeah, it's strange. I mean, I think, for me, I'm not a terribly theoretical person. I mean, even in college, I didn't, my courses were not, we didn't have a political science major. We had a government major. And so it didn't mean anything to me at the time, really. I had nothing to compare it to, but my inclination is not to really get too caught up in the theoretical. I mean, that's that's always been my approach, for better or for worse. And so at least in these contexts, I feel like I have sort of an advantage, because they're talking in a theoretical level and I'm just talking in a sort of a more, I guess, present perspective.
Yeah, fair enough. Forrest, do we have Daryl Perry?
Oh, next we were gonna do the McDonald's boycott one.
Oh, sorry, you're right. Yep.
Yeah.
No, actually, that's good. I want to talk about this.
Yeah. All right.
Right. Like we know what would happen if you raised McDonald's, if fast food restaurants were required to raise their minimum wage. We know what would happen. We know the impact it would have even if they didn't absorb any of the loss in profits, even if it was just passed on. We know exactly how much they would have to charge extra on a burger. I mean, it would be something like, I don't know, 15, 20 cents. So
wouldn't it make, look at the difference between Costco and Walmart. I mean, Costco has chosen to pay its employees much higher than Walmart, and as a consumer, I go to Costco instead of Walmart. So if you're trying to make business decisions, to make business decisions on behalf of McDonald's, I recommend that you buy McDonald's. We love to use.
Hey, right now I'm subsidizing McDonald's right now, and you are too. We're both subsidizing McDonald's right now, because the reason why those workers don't die of hunger is because something like, what is it? 40% of them are on food stamps. We're also paying for their Medicaid. In fact, McDonald's has part of their budget is to pay people to advise their own employees to go have the government pay and subsidize their business by paying for food stamps and Medicaid. And I have no problem, frankly, with the idea in general of making sure that poor people who can't afford to eat or get medicine will get that. But at the same time, you can't argue to me that this is all just McDonald's purview. I'm sorry. I'm supporting their workforce.
I mean, it sounds to me that, you know, we shouldn't be buying anything from McDonald's. This sounds like a horrible place to buy a burger.
Well, that's not the point here. McDonald's, Burger King, it doesn't matter. Walmart, we do the same thing with Walmart. We do the same thing with Walmart.
There's a local burger joint right around the corner from me that pays their employees $15 an hour. And I know that because my niece's friend came to live with us.
You're avoiding the point I just made.
No, it's a great point, and that's why I won't buy stuff from McDonald's.
And how much of an impact is that having?
Virtually zero.
Right. Right.
Yeah, which is one that I found interesting because this is something I've noticed with other libertarians. You know, they're sort of very fond of the idea that if you have any problem with anything that's, you know, anything bad in the private sector, or you want like the economic system to be different in some way, then you can just solve this through consumer behavior or like
the market will sort it out.
Yeah. So you can, I mean, like a sort of extreme example, this, you know, libertarians who say, hey, you know, you want, you know, you don't think that workers have enough power in regular capitalist workplaces, just, you know, they could just all pool their pennies together and start new worker-owned businesses that they'll start at, you know, and this is the same principle. You know, McDonald's doesn't need to raise its wages. You know, you just need to not buy, you know, from McDonald's, which seems like a really like why they do this, right? Like it seems like the real thing is this is the only way of doing anything about this problem that would be consistent with libertarian principles. So, you know, so what else are they going to say? But it's also like they're just kind of often packaging into the way it's asked the assumption that like this is a realistic plan. This is just something that could fix these problems.
Well, I think it's important for them to believe that the market, and they do believe that the market is the most efficient way and of allocating resources, A, and B, I think that it extends into some type of thing that the market is the best expression of morality. In morality, you know, like I wouldn't necessarily put it in terms of morality, but in terms of best outcomes. And so this comes up a lot in the context of like racism and the idea that, like, you know, the Civil Rights Act, like, Rand Paul got caught up on this. I think, like, I don't know what it was, 10 years ago, I think, with Rachel Maddow or something to that effect.
Yeah, he was running for Senate first time in like 2012.
Yeah,
and he bit the bullet. He said that he would have voted against the Civil Rights Act because that's stopping private business owners from doing what they want with their property.
Right, and that is always like a sort of almost, I want to say every debate I had with a libertarian ended up there, but a lot of them do, because they believe that it is an infringement, that you cannot have, they believe in this sort of like Lochner era type of notion of a freedom of contract, and that every, you know, and that you cannot interfere in commerce that has nothing to do with government. And the idea that, you know, and they say, you know, if it's a restaurant wouldn't serve a black person, I wouldn't go there. And I would imagine that it would never survive. And it's like, wait, I'm sorry. You can't find examples of racist or homophobic or transphobic or misogynist, you know, entities in this country that can survive? Are you serious? Like, of course they can. I mean, some of them, like, you know, I don't know, what would it, like Chick-fil-A or
people go to Chick-fil-A specifically to support them.
Yeah, I mean, that's absurd. It's absurd. Yeah. Everybody knows that's absurd. But they have to believe that the market, at least in this context, right? I mean, this is, you know, slightly different from their, you know, well, it's an extension of their belief in property as the key fundamental right. But it gets really uncomfortable for them when they realize, like, oh, well, if the government has no say in what happens in terms of commerce, if say I'm black and I go to a small town and they don't allow me at the hotel, well, you could just go to another hotel. Well, you know,
You
there's
keep
plenty of
driving every
towns.
50 miles and yeah.
Exactly. Or what if I need to do business there? Like their system breaks down at these points. These are points where they break down. And it is really just I mean, you could go further and talk about the you know, the economic implications of their market Uber alles, but they ultimately don't care, right? I mean, these are folks who believe that like if you die because you can't afford health insurance, that's okay, right? Like they don't. I mean, I think Ron Paul more or less said the same. Like, that's okay.
No,
that
well,
is,
yeah. I mean, Ron Paul did the thing that's like the equivalent of saying, "Oh, don't worry, you know, the segregated businesses will be punished by the market." For the healthcare example, sort of like he had, like in, I think it was also 2000. Yeah,
it was specifically about money, though, for him, as opposed to race or creed. And it's just that they, at that point, it's like, well, all right, well, end of conversation, at least on that topic, because, you know, and I should be clear, I'm not trying to convince these guys of anything.
Of course.
I'm trying to demonstrate the ridiculousness of their positions. And so once you get to the point where they say like, well, yeah, if you don't have the money to pay for health insurance, you don't get health insurance and you die. Okay. Thank you. We'll leave that there and move on to something else. Like,
yeah. Once you get up to the point where the guys advocate saying that the solution is assassinations, you can, it's like, all right, I'm done here. This is, you know, this is what I wanted to do. I remember Elizabeth Brunig said that, you know, half the point of a debate is to get the other person to say what they believe.
Absolutely.
You know, yeah.
And it's just like a question of like, at one point it's like, well, I get some bad news for you. The vast majority of Americans feel that no, you shouldn't die because you don't have money. And, you know, people absorb it and digest it in other ways and maybe try and like sort of keep it at arm's length. But this guy's out there saying it right out. And it's like, okay, good. You have now shown where this philosophy of yours leads. And my job is done here.
Yeah, because I think that like you can have it like there, you know, libertarianism, like anything else, I think you can argue for it either like in a consequentialist way, you say this will lead to good outcomes, or on principle, you know, deontologically, you say this is my principle, doesn't matter if it leads to bad outcomes. And oftentimes I think that like when people have like feel the appeal of libertarianism, it's really the in principle thing, because if you're thinking about certain kinds of examples about, you know, it's like I should be able to, you know, use whatever drugs I want, I should be able to do this and that, then, you know, then this, you know, this sort of set of principles that sound very appealing and sort of smuggle in all the economic stuff by associating it with those sort of personal autonomy rights. That sounds very appealing. But then when you get down to these questions, you know, which like, you know, if we're just talking about bodily autonomy, yeah, sure. I mean, you can embrace the, you know, we don't draft people to like, you know, to take their kidneys against their will, you know, for kidney transplants. And I'm sure we'd all be against that. So that's, yeah, some, you know, people can die because the principle is just that important, you know, but for something like this, well, what, you know, that question that was asked, you were talking about at the presidential debate, when Ron Paul was asked about, okay, what about the worker was healthy and didn't get health insurance, and, you know, he has an operation, and if he doesn't get it, you know, then he'll die. You know, Paul in that case, like, didn't want to just say, yeah, okay, he can die. Although some people in the Republican debate audience, I think, were actually yelling that as he was saying that. But Paul didn't want to say that. He knows how bad that sounds. So he said, well, in the old days, the church would have taken up a collection. You know, you would have paid for it that way. You know, which is which yeah.
If it was true, we would have no need for any of the conversations, right? I mean, it's a lot. I mean, to a certain extent. I mean, at least for me, that is what I think the problem of having, you know, I mean, I have some very, very broad principles in the way that I assess our politics, but they are very, very general, because in my experience, the whole idea about deploying this many principles is simply a way of pretending that we're not making choices as a society. That it is like, well, you know, there's certain laws of nature, and there are certain, and I don't, I think that's simply a way of obscuring the fact that there are certain choices that we are making as a society. And it's a way of almost in the same way that like a corporation allows things to happen that are no one's responsibility, right? I feel like principles in this context serve that same function. Like this is, look, it's a principle. And when I play my logic games, the principles hold up. And so therefore, I'm sorry, you can't afford health insurance, you die. It's not up to me. It's the way nature works. And it is a way of obscuring the fact that we're making decisions as a society. And I think ultimately that's, you know, that's where we end up at most of the end of these debates.
Right. Fair enough. Forrest, do you have the, there we go.
Do you think there are any rights that we have in America that are not recognized by the U.S. government?
Yeah, I don't, according to the United States government, I don't have the right to secede from the United States of America. According to the United States government, if I decide not to pay certain taxes, I run the risk of either having my stuff seized or going to jail or both.
Okay, wait a second. You don't have the right to secede? Can't you renounce your citizenship?
The United States government claims that if I wish to renounce my citizenship, I must leave the territory that the United States government claims to own, and then I must pay an exit fee of, I believe, $4,500. And there are hoops and hurdles that I have to go through. And if I don't follow those to the letter that the United States government says I'm supposed to follow, they will not recognize the renunciation of citizenship. But why should I have to leave? I should be able to live on the piece of land that I want to live on. And as long as I'm not violating the rights of another person, I should be able to, you know, claim the free state of Daryl.
Okay. But aren't you that property that you're living on, that land, is that really yours? How did you get that property?
Well, based on the current paradigm, nobody can really own land because try not paying your local property taxes. After 3 years, some local government will come kick you off of your land and sell the land to the highest bidder. So currently, no one can own property.
Okay, so you have no property here. So I don't understand, like, you know, how would you possibly secede?
Well, right now, you're not allowed to. Right now, if you go buy a piece of land from someone and you say, I don't want to be part of the town, I don't want to benefit in any way from any of the supposed services that the town provides, I'm not going to send you any money, I'm not going to use your schools, I'm not going to use your fire department, I just want to live on my land and be completely self-sufficient and not pay your taxes. After 3 years, the town would come, kick you off of your property, and seize your land.
How would you know it's your land? How would you prove that it's your land?
Well, in theory, you would have a property deed because that's what happens when you buy property.
Who would issue the property deed?
You get a deed. Well, right now, there are governments that issue those things. And what I'm saying is we're talking about the current paradigm of how could you own land? And there are things right now that exist. When you go buy land, you get a deed for the land.
Right.
If you're talking about what would happen in a free society, then there would be competing agencies probably that would issue such deeds.
Which one would
You're asking me to centrally plan liberty, and that's not what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in,
Wait a
Sam,
second. I want to hear about that other paradigm.
Right. Hold on, Sam. Hold on. Let me finish my thought, and if you keep trying to piss me off, I will disconnect from the call. So you're asking me to centrally plan liberty. I'm not interested in centrally planning liberty. I'm interested in promoting the idea of human freedom.
Okay, so wait a second. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you.
Not true.
I'm just trying to figure out.
I think you absolutely did mean to upset me.
No,
I think you absolutely do want to try to push me into a corner to where you can say, see, you don't have the answers of how freedom works. Damn it, Sam. Nobody has all the answers on how freedom works. That's why freedom is so important.
My point is this, is that libertarians, if I'm not mistaken, do not like the fact that a government has a monopoly of force. And I am suggesting that in this case of a piece of property where we don't know who it belongs to, there are 3 agencies that say it's mine. There's 1 agency that says it's yours. You believe that your agency is the most legit agency and that my 3 agencies are corrupt. I believe I've got 3 agencies. 3 is more than 1. Well, you say, look, I'm going to go find 2 other agencies that say that this property belongs to me. And then the question becomes, how do we resolve this? And you're saying like, well, it's just going to work out. And I'm saying that at the end of the day, when we actually walk through this in reality, even if it's your paradigm, your reality,
freedom doesn't work.
I'm saying that that's
You're
right.
saying freedom doesn't
I'm
work.
saying that's correct. That
You're
we're going to need an
that-
authority that's going to adjudicate this. And that authority ultimately is going to have a monopoly of power. And the only way that we're going to function and not end up in a fight that is going to determine this is if we all agree mutually, my agencies, your agencies, my people, your people, we all agree to submit to a authority that has a monopoly of power. Now, the best case scenario is that we make sure that this authority is at least as representative of us as possible. That's what I'm suggesting.
Let me ask this question, Sam.
Yes.
What happens if I don't pay taxes to your authority?
To our authority?
What happens? You're the one saying that we need a group that has legitimate use on the force of violence to force people to do what is best. And I'm saying, what should happen to me if I refuse to pay for your agency that is going to force people to do what you believe is best?
So in other words,
if I decide I don't like your agency killing people in the Middle East, I will not fund that. What should happen to me?
Well, I mean, I think if you don't pay your taxes to our government, they'll ultimately put you in jail.
No, I'm asking you, Sam, what do you think should happen? Not what does happen, because we know what does happen. What do you think? I want you to say it. I want you to say that I belong in jail because I don't pay taxes.
If you don't pay taxes to the U.S. government, ultimately, I think you belong in jail.
Thank you for saying that, Sam. You're a horrible, despicable person. Thank you for having me on your show.
Daryl? Heavyweight.
Walter Block looks like the Dalai Lama.
Well, I thought he was talking hypothetically. I don't think that I would necessarily put him in jail right now. But yeah, I think if you don't pay your taxes that are due, yeah, I mean, I think if it's, I think you should get an opportunity to pay a fine first. And but I think he wanted me to say, he kept saying, say. So I said it. And I'm sorry that ended so quickly.
You're a snitch in the world of libertarians, Seder.
Yeah, it's true.
Snitching them out on all them back taxes they ain't paying. It's fucked up.
We should say that Daryl was a candidate, primary candidate in the 2012 Libertarian, I think, campaign, or maybe it was 2016. I think it was 2012.
I think it was 16, and I think he ran against Johnson.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, yeah.
So was he one of those guys on stage when Johnson was it's legitimate for the government to license drivers?
Yes, and we're booed. I mean, look, I mean, the vision that these guys have of the world, I think, is, it's a nice one. But it is, and every step along the way that it would take to get to their utopia, which I think is impossible, incidentally, is horrible for people. Like I think like there are, in my mind, utopians on the left, and every step of the way towards that utopia on the left, I think is good. And so like I don't know that you'll ever get to your utopia, but like if you get an eighth of the way there, it's better than where we are today. If you get a half of the way there, it's better than where we are today. Right. You get 3/4 or 7/8 or whatever it is. But with libertarianism, any step in that direction of that utopia you'll never reach is a bad situation as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and like the actual vision of utopia that he just gave, that you have like different private like agencies that are all in the business of like violently enforcing people's rights, like that just sounds. I mean, like that sounds like a dystopia. Like
that's
like
feudalism. That's Mad Max. It's maybe like
that's
I guess
the world that they want, though.
Well, that's the thing, is that ultimately it really behooves you if you have an army already. If you already have amassed a certain amount, like if you are a small, like, duke who has a fairly sizable army, then yeah, actually that might be a good situation. I mean, all of libertarianism, it seems to me, is sort of like, we're going to create a year zero that necessarily leaves me, very often, not me, Sam Seder, but me, the person speaking, in a position of power that things are going to work out for me if we start from that point. Like that was the conversation with Walter Block. I was like, when do you start counting property rights? Like, and it turned out, I believe, if my memory serves me, if I'm misremembering this, please forgive me, that it was basically when America was colonized.
Right.
So, coincidentally, we're going to start the clock at that point because of some French theory.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, well,
emancipation,
it's like some like, how the land is valuable because of the labor you put on it, et cetera, et cetera. We're just going to ignore the labor that actually, the indigenous people who lived here. Like, there's a reason why the forests were so lush in the Northeast, because there was controlled burns, by the Iroquois. We're just going to ignore the fact that like some of these plants are domesticated, some of these animals are domesticated. Like, I'm not even sure that is the way to measure it, but they don't count that. And they go like, we're going to start here. And then from there, everything is going to be really consistent. You just don't go into the forbidden zone, which is before we actually had amassed a certain army, essentially. And that's,
yeah. And so, I mean, I guess there too, like there's the historical issue that, which is that a lot of libertarians, like the kind of deontological libertarians, people who think that it doesn't matter if there are bad outcomes, this is just a principle and you have to follow it no matter what, they want to say that, well, it's okay if you have wealth inequality as long as it came about the right way. Nobody's rights were being violated. But then, of course, as you point out, the inequality we actually have did not come about all that way, right? That's like even in like Europe and the UK, we had enclosure of common lands to drive peasants off to like work in factories, and that's like and that was a very cozy and consensual history compared to what happened in the New World. But then the other issue is, okay, let's say we could somehow like shake the Etch-a-Sketch so that like we actually did start out with like a completely pristine starting point for all property claims, or we had like, or just the history of the world was very different, and it was just like Adam and Eve and their descendants like freeholding unclaimed land. Even in that scenario, I still want to know about these like competing protection agencies, because that still sounds like a nightmare.
Well, because they haven't been anywhere, right? They've never been to places like Brazil, where there's literally like private in law enforcement.
Yeah, they're like private militias that actually control massive amounts of territory.
And I used to watch your show, Sam. I live in California still. I'm native California. Lived in West Oakland, across the street from a very large homeless encampment, which is kind of the epitome of this free market that these guys love.
Right.
It definitely was a free drug market that had no police intervention whatsoever. And there was definitely issues with that free market from, cars exploding randomly from Molotovs and all the other things. But I always think about that. I used to watch these funny calls living in that environment and always think, I wish these guys would come down and see this libertarian paradise.
Well, because literally in that scenario, I mean, the thing that people who say things like that, we can have competing protection agencies. The thing that they'll say is, well, what our theory predicts is that because going to war with each other is very expensive and, there are bad things there, that like what they'll choose to do is like seek adjudication at some like independent court or something like that. It's like, well, you could say the same thing and just predict that like actual literal drug gangs would never go to war with each other because it's very expensive.
It's bad for business. Yeah, of course. Well, Walter Block actually had introduced me to this idea of, I think when we were talking about adjudicating property claims, that, well, I would have my court and he would have his court. And I'm like, okay, so who adjudicates our two courts? And then there would be a third court and it would just keep going on and on until eventually somebody... silly. No, it's ridiculous. And then ultimately, it all ends with somebody going, you know what? F you. Here's my gun. And then they go like, you know what? Here's my gun. It's bigger. And then that's it. We're just at war. That's basically it. I mean, that's the way it works.
Yeah, mafia families have people that could go to have sit downs too, but that doesn't mean that they never shoot each other.
Of course. It's like, that is like, we live in a world. Like there's history, it's like, what do people think wars are? Like, what do people think conflict is a function of? It's like, there is, and I've had this conversation, it feels like a million times with a bunch of different guys. There was, gosh, I can't remember his name now, but he was, I'm a very nice guy. Adam
Kokesh.
Yes, Adam Kokesh. And
didn't you have him on too, Ben?
Yeah, I did. And he was a very nice guy. And I thought he was a pretty ballsy guy. I saw some videos of him in the past, but like at one point he's like, I want a piece of land, and I'm only going to take the land that I labor on. And I go, okay, well, so what happens if Chevron shows up and says like, hey man, your land that you're working on, yeah, it's great. You're creating value. You're growing lettuce. There's oil underneath there. So we're going to just set up a drilling unit, if you don't mind, in your garden. Well, I would tell them they can't do that. It's my land. And I'm like, okay. And then what? Because I'm Chevron. And guess what? I got a bigger, in like 15 minutes, I can have a bunch of guys here with baseball bats. If you're lucky, just baseball bats. What are you going to do about it? Well, I'll get my guys with baseball bats. Well, guess what? I'm Chevron. So I just like, whatever number you got, I got 5 times that. And then I'm going to go to your guys and I'm going to say, whatever he's paying you, 5 times that. And then I'm going to start drilling oil in your garden. And that's it. There's no, like, that's it. I mean, that's it. And they get a little bit sort of stumped at that moment because it's not, let's face it, like it's not that far from perfect examples that we have in history of Chevron coming in and saying like, we're going to take this and you get an issue with it. Like, suck it.
North Dakota.
Perfect example.
The bucket in North Dakota. Great example.
Yeah. Never mind all of the like United Fruit Company coups in Latin America.
Exactly.
Oh God.
Exactly.
And they don't understand any of that. That's kind of like not in their wheelhouse.
It's not in their wheelhouse. Yeah, it's not in their wheelhouse. It's not in like their garage. It's not like in their pantry. It's just like, it's very interesting that that never comes up. Like history, like all of this just doesn't seem to compute into the theory that they have. So,
yeah, Right, exactly. Well, really appreciate you coming on, Sam. This is a lot of fun. This is something I wanted to actually. It's an idea I had very soon after the show started. Since as as Jason mentioned, like Adam Kokesh, that guy. That guy's been on this show to argue with me. Walter Block.
Have you had Walter Block on?
I have had Walter Block on. Yep.
Did he go for the?
No, he didn't. I didn't get any hey, but
did you get anything about Walter had an interesting. The age of consent plays heavily in a lot of
that's interesting, isn't it?
Theories. I mean. Yeah, it is interesting. But
and so like there's the age of consent stuff, and there's also just the fact that so much of that stuff is like a go-to metaphor for so many of these guys.
It's
like that's like the first thing that they come up with. It's like, well, this is just like rape, or this is just like pedophilia. It's like these aren't the metaphors I would have started with.
I know. I find it fascinating that they don't stop and go like, "Oh, wait a second. There's other people listening to me. Maybe I should actually not." Oh boy, there it is. I would love to see that.
If I were the king of the black people and I wanted to promote black welfare.
This is a clip you want to pull up, huh, Ben?
Yeah, actually, so Sam was looking down at just the right moment for us. Let's have that one more time.
I were the king of the black people, and I wanted to promote black welfare.
The king of the black people. Oh my God! Wow.
Yeah.
How the hell did black people get into y'all's conversation? I just want to know what the hell was y'all talking about to make that man say that if he was the king of the black people right there, the whole call should have stopped and been like, whoa, why did
Ben deceptively edited that because just beforehand, Ben had said, if I was the Duke of black people. And then Walter Block only came back with, well, if I was the king of black people. That's the thing, is that it was all Ben leading into if you
Walter Block, Wakanda forever.
Oh
yeah. So I had, trust me, Jason, I was not the one who introduced the actually anything having to do with race into that conversation. But I think if I'm remembering correctly, the context was something about the minimum wage and like why. I think I might be getting this wrong. I assume Walter Block does not watch the show, but if he does, and I'm getting this wrong, my apologies. But I think that he was making the claim that like one of the reasons it would be good not to have minimum wage laws is because then like there wouldn't be like so many black people who were unemployed. Like why he had to make it specifically about black people who are unemployed. You can take
he's bumping Nas before the whole thing. If I rule the world, he's getting fired up. He's like he's like Eminem and 8 Mile before this shit goes down. That's it. The only way that he can say that is if that's what happens beforehand. If he's doing an Eminem 8 Mile kind of.
That's right. He was psyching himself up and he was just in the mood. I don't know why. Yeah. I had the minimum wage and the elevator operators and the something is better than nothing.
Oh yeah. He was super intense about how you had to like admit that, that being paid nothing was less than being paid minimum wage. Like that was something like the conversation could go no further until everybody agreed, that zero was less.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's imagine that guy debating Pascal, Ben.
Yeah, that's man. Actually, I kind of want to have that happen. But yeah, we might have to set that up. But that is like, again, it's the same thing we were talking about earlier, because I would think the only thing that would actually need to be said in that conversation about that particular point is like, well, look, we don't have to speculate. There are all these studies about the employment effects of minimum wage increases, and and it doesn't seem to bear out the idea that there's some like huge automatic, relationship there, that if you if you bump up the minimum wage, employment rises also. And so because that doesn't seem to actually happen, I mean, even if it did happen, we could still talk about like, okay, is this if like 30 million people are making less than $15 an hour, and like 29 of them now get to make a living wage, and 1 million of them lose their jobs, is that like a net like loss? But like that doesn't seem to happen anyway.
They can't. They cannot engage with data, because once they do that, it's over for them, because the whole thing they're constructing is completely theoretical. And so it can't be about outcomes. They can't just for clarity, there is no king of the black people.
Okay, thank you.
But that's the problem that they have in these arguments, is that as soon as they engage data whatsoever, they're also done, because it's not about outcomes. It has to be about these sort of like primary principles, core principles that are transcendent from people's lived experience. And once they bring it down into the the realm of data and evidence, then the whole thing falls apart, because at one point their principles bump up against the evidence. So they can't ever acknowledge that, even though there may be some, some toeholds. Like you could say like, okay, it's one thing to raise the minimum wage, but would you do it at, $50 an hour? I mean, there's undoubtedly a minimum wage that would begin to undercut the number of jobs.
Sure.
Within the context of the system that we have now. But they can't really engage in that, because then all of a sudden they're no longer libertarians. And it's not just about the government shouldn't interfere into this. They, they shouldn't allow for child labor laws either.
Right.
Or a 40-hour work week. I mean, honestly, that's the only intellectually consistent plan that they have.
No, I mean, it would be like, I mean, certainly I guess with the child labor, you could argue that, that children are capable of, making contracts, but like certainly a 40-hour week. I mean, if you, from there, what's the difference?
Go back to the Lochner era, and when Brandeis had to argue for child labor laws. I mean, that's what the court held. Was that like, this is the parents, if the parents are okay with it, they can enter into the contract with.
Well, I don't know if you talked about on your show, was it a couple months ago? There was that piece in the Guardian about how child labor isn't so bad.
I remember that one.
Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation actually funded the article.
Oh, geez, that doesn't shock me,
because it helps develop third world countries. And so, we shouldn't be like cultural imperialists telling them, they can't have, they can't have child labor. So
who cares if someone loses a finger in a mine?
There you go.
Yeah. Oh, here we go. Yeah.
And I like that picture too. It's one of those real like, see, this is what Africa looks like.
Which one of them?
I was the king of the black people.
I don't know. Like nobody's wearing a crown here, so I can't tell who the king is.
Yeah, they got so many crowns.
This is Walter Locke's dream. Locke's dream.
God. All right. Well.
All right. Thank you so much, Sam.
Ben, real pleasure. Jason,
right.
great to meet
Nice
you.
to meet you.
All
Nice to
right.
meet you.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, Sam. All right. Going to bring on Touré Reed, who is, among other things, the author of a very good book that I have been reading called Toward Freedom. Yep, that's the one. The case against race reductionism, and we're going to talk about what he means by that. But first, Touré, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I also get to hang out with my homie Jason, who is that a Purple Rain shirt? Is that what you're wearing? All right. Well, I'm gonna have to tell my wife about this. I don't even think she's watching.
That's cold. She better be watching.
I don't think she is. I think she's exercising.
Oh, she's a cold piece right now because this is the show she needs to be watching.
I hear that.
This is Jason and Touré with Ben Burgis.
I think she's trying to make me feel bad for falling down on the exercise job during COVID-19. I'm getting out of shape.
Yeah, fair enough. I was actually doing great for a while at the beginning of the pandemic. I was like running all the time, and then like my back started hurt, and I stopped doing that, and I started doing way too much of this, and I have
everything's being DoorDashed.
Well, you know, and DoorDash and Grubhub have those commercials that make clear that the only source of satisfaction that you can get during the pandemic is having food delivered to you. So everybody's dancing when they get their food delivered and everything.
There's commercials?
Yes. Yeah, it's like I think it's Grubhub has like a Pixar-inspired commercial. It's very diverse, though.
Yeah, Pixar-inspired commercial.
It is.
That's gross.
I'm not a fan, but you know, there it is. Every time I see it, I go and order something.
I think you had an audio issue, Touré.
Oh, yeah? You can't hear me?
We can hear you, but it just kind of sounds like almost like a Cylon from
that again.
The original Battlestar Galactica.
Let me see if I can turn the volume down, because that's probably what it is, I assume.
All right. So I'm gonna apologize in advance for doing this, but since you're like, this is really bad because you were nice enough to come on the show, and should probably not be subjecting you to this, but I'm going to do it anyway. So yeah, let's watch this clip.
It's actually that hard to figure out. We have it at our core that a certain group of people, you know, who are marked by ancestry, you know, who are marked by melanin, must represent a bottom for us. And you know, you can see that, you know, in the era of enslavement, you can see that literally being written, as I, you know, show in the piece, into the laws. You can see that, you know, when we decide, you know, to, you know, in this period of enslavement, and yet we still can't, you know, get away from, you know, having a two-tiered society. You can see it, you know, most depressingly, I have to say for me, when we go to erect our modern safety net during the New Deal, which, you know, progressives and, you know, and I consider myself in that camp, you know, like to say, you know, that was the era, you know, that was our golden era. Social Security, when it's initially passed, excluded African Americans. Now, it wasn't written that way. What was written was folks who were either, you know, worked as farmhands or worked as help in the house.
Domestic help.
Domestic help. Yes, they were excluded. But what that had the effect of doing is excluding, I think, roughly 80% of African Americans in the South, and something around 65% of African Americans nationally. And what people will tell you is, well, that got fixed, and it did get fixed. But the problem is, during those years, people are injured. And that's how you get a gap. The fact that, you know, you injure people for those years, it doesn't mean that, you know, people will catch up when you eventually fix it. Well, Clyde Ross bought a home at the time, or attempted to buy a home at a time in which home buying in this country was subsidized, where we had an FHA that insured loans, so that, you know, if, for instance, I wanted to go, you know, buy a home and I, you know, weren't able to pay for it, the FHA would say, you know, no problem, we'll cover that if he, you know, walks out on his home. African Americans were totally cut out of that.
FHA, Federal Housing Administration.
Yes, exactly. And not only were they cut out of it, we had redlining, which is a phrase that, you know, we all know, but we don't talk enough about. Wherein it was said a neighborhood in which African Americans live cannot receive FHA funding. And that went beyond the FHA. Banks decided who they were going to lend money to based on FHA policy. Largely, they respond to that in much the same way. On the Atlantic website, you'll see we have actual maps where you can look at a city like Chicago and see where the loans were and where the loans weren't. And this was a practice that, you know, lasted on paper into 1960, and likely much longer than that.
So you go on until America reckons with the moral debt it has accrued and the practical damage it has done to generations of Black Americans, it will fail to live up to its own ideals. Talk for just another moment about that practical damage.
The most obvious example that is obvious is the wealth gap. You know, when you have a family, you know, on average, you know, it's 20 times the wealth. You know, a white family with 20 times the wealth of Black families. And then you can really trace this to actual policy. You see it. Again, you know, when we look at these incarceration rates, we so see it. I mean, the gap is so huge. It's not a mere minor discrepancy. We just aren't having a conversation, and you can't substitute and say poor children. You know, that's a separate problem. That's another problem. It's a real problem, a related problem. It's a separate problem. Until we, directly confront the problem of racism, I don't think we're getting at it.
Help us to understand this point in your piece. Quote, to ignore the fact that one of the oldest republics in the world was erected on a foundation of white supremacy, to pretend that the problems of a dual society are the same as the problems of unregulated capitalism, is to cover the sin of national plunder with the sin of national lying. The lie ignores the fact that reducing American poverty and ending white supremacy are not the same.
Right.
Explain that.
There are plenty of African Americans in this country, and I would say that this goes right up to the White House, who are not by any means poor, but are very much afflicted by white supremacy.
So talk about.
Oh Jesus, you got a whole fucking medley of his biggest hits, huh?
Yeah. So Touré, this is this guy seems to make sense. I assume we all agree with everything that we just heard.
We were literally talking about this, Touré and I, the other day, because I had watched not Ta-Nehisi. There was another cat that was on the internet saying that there is no difference between race and class. And when I brought up the Oprah Winfrey purse situation, they were like, "Yeah, that's proves my point. She was discriminated against. Therefore, we are a permanent underclass." Regardless of the fact that she can afford a $38,000 purse, that's not the point. The point is that someone thought that she was not worthy of said purse.
Which she bought somebody's else. Right. That's what happened. You can still afford it.
All right, the audio issues got
worse. It's still messed up. So let's try this.
Yeah. All right. Well, he's muted right now.
But yeah, it's actually funny that you play that clip, because we were really having this conversation, and more often than not, we actually have this type of conversation, not so much about Coates, but I have brought up Coates on the show mainly to mess with Pascal. Like, nothing makes Pascal more angry than when I bring up Coates. And when I brought up the fact that Coates is writing the new Superman, or he actually wrote a Superman comic where Superman is black. He's the 44th president, and he's got blue eyes.
All right.
So have I resolved the microphone issue?
Yes.
Cool. Sounds good.
All right. So yeah, I don't want to talk about the handbag anymore, because then people, come at me for hating on Oprah for being able to afford that handbag, but not being able to buy
$38,000 handbag, which, I like, we do live in a society where there are literally people who die because they can't fund their GoFundMe's to pay for insulin. So, that
Right.
coexisting with $38,000 handbags does strike me as an issue, but
all the same.
Well, I'll tell you what.
Going back to the clip, though, Coates says that equating, that the country has erected a foundation of white supremacy, and so equating the achievement of racial equality with something about capitalism is to cover up the sin of white supremacy with a sin of lying. That's his position.
Yeah. And, that's now, as Jason alluded to, a pretty commonplace, take on things, right? I mean, I think Ta-Nehisi Coates had done a lot to sort of mainstream this kind of black nationalist narrative, right? And now I have white people coming at me, telling me that I'm underestimating the force of racism. And I won't tell you what goes through my mind. I'll have to play, because this is, being broadcast, right? And we save for posterity. And I have to bite my tongue at my job, because it's my job. Right. But nevertheless, we'll just say it's infuriating on some level to have some white person who just discovered racism 5 years ago, right? I mean, it's literally often enough It's literally the same people who pissed me off, that I'll say, between 2008 and 2015, maybe 2008, 2014, who had embraced post-racialism, right? So the same people who, embraced Obama's embrace of underclass tropes, right? And insisted that Obama would be, good for Black people as the role model in chief. Then, a few years later, sometime between the Tea Party and the publication of the case for reparations, that's when it is. And in the worst case scenario, Trump, the election of Trump, right? So those three signature moments, they discover racism and insist that racism is our original sin. And the thing that's kind of striking to me about that, and I'll take this to Coach more directly in a second, is, and I've said this elsewhere, I went to Catholic school for 8 years. And as 8 years in Catholic school was going to do, at least if my parents had anything to do with it, I ended up agnostic, right? If I'd done 12 years in Catholic school, I would be an atheist. But 8 years was the fast track to agnosticism. I
remember one of my all-time favorite lines from one of your father's interviews on TMBS is what he said. He was describing like a certain kind of unhelpful left moralism, and he said, "This is too Protestant a way of thinking about politics. It seems to be all about who's going to heaven and who's going to hell." And then I remember he followed that up by saying, "If you have kids, it's very important that you raise them either Catholic or Jewish, or there's a danger they'll end up religious."
Yep, it's the guilt, right? I mean, it's the guilt that turns you off in the grand scheme of things. And I still feel guilty about 2 errors I committed at shortstop when I was 9. And that was a long, long time ago. So and far from my worst sin. But one of the few things that I took from Catholic school was the meaning of original sin. And I know, now I hear an echo, I don't know if you do, but I know that original sin is something that you're stuck with, right? So for all intent and purpose, these people who embrace this narrative that Coates has helped popularize, what they're saying is that racism is an eternal force that can never be exercised, right? And for all intent and purpose, Coates, by the way, in addition to using a kind of sin metaphor, likewise uses the Alcoholics Anonymous metaphor too, right? And it's 2 versions of the same thing. Like the racism is our original sin, but he at some point, compares a racist to an alcoholic. And of course, the thing that one has to do if one takes the AA take on alcoholism seriously, you're an alcoholic for the rest of your life too, right? So it's a constant struggle against being a racist, but it's baked into you. And in the case of AA, I mean, they literally say that it's, people have genetic dispositions to be alcoholics, right? So anyway, so all of that stuff is just on its own terms fascinatingly creepy and scary. Because we've licensed in the name of liberalism a notion, reification of race, right? I mean, we've licensed the idea that racism exists in some way apart from the world of the mind, right? Of human invention, right? Because it's taken on a life of its own, which is how it's seeped into our DNA. But when you get to the particulars, from the Coates quote, the Coates clip, there are a couple of things that are pretty striking about it. Even beyond the sins and all that stuff. The SSA, exemptions for agricultural and domestic workers, for example. Well, actually, I'll go this way with it. We're all scholars here, so I'm just curious, right? And I think this is worth saying for the audience broadly. There seems to be an assumption, and this is what's kind of interesting to me about watching the Bill Moyers clip, because I hadn't watched that clip before, and there were points that I had some problems, not chuckling to myself. And as a professor, I chuckle, right? I mean, that's something that comes with the doctorate, right? I didn't chuckle before then. But anyway, it seems that a lot of people, seem to imagine that nobody knew about FHA mortgage discrimination or, so redlining or the SSA exemptions for domestic and agricultural workers until around 2014, right? And in fact, I mean, in some book titles, I don't know that I want to name them, but in some book titles, one that I'm thinking of in particular that I know Jason knows very well, the title, I think the subtitle or something is like The Forgotten History of Housing Discrimination.
Your segregation. Yeah.
And what I think is kind of interesting about it, and I've taken to asking my students this when we talk about, coats or redlining or, whatever, right? Anything on the spectrum of what he's popularized. I've asked my students, how long do you think scholars have been talking about these issues, right? Or I've even asked them, in addition to, the broad questions about SSA exemptions for agriculture and domestic workers or HOLC FHA, I asked them, how long do you think scholars have discussed that the fact that the New Deal's rewards were spread unevenly? In other words, how long have scholars discussed the fact that the New Deal suffered, as one would expect, from racial discrimination, right? And a lot of my students reflex, people have only known this the last several years, right? I mean, they end up, coalescing around the kind of Coates-related common sense of how this works, as if this was a recent discovery. And I always tell them that, I first learned about the unevenness of the New Deal's rewards in the fall of 1988, in my first year of college, when I was taking a course on the New Deal and World War II or something like that, right? And it was a great course taught by Aaron Berman at Hampshire College. Go Hampshire and go Aaron Berman. And in that course, we read Mark Nason's book on communists in Harlem during the Depression. We read, crucially, Sitkoff's book, A New Deal for Blacks, and a couple other, big books as well. And, Sitkoff's book, which was my introduction to it, was published 10 years before I entered college, right? So it was published in 1978. And there's a host of scholarship that came after, but even before, scholars have been exploring the implications of redlining since at least the 1960s, right? At least the 1960s. So it wasn't this arcane tidbit that it took an investigative journalist to discover. All you have to do is take a U.S. history course, right? If you take a U.S. history course that isn't a survey, right? It can't be a survey necessarily, but my surveys cover it because I'm me. And every student I've taught for 20 years has learned about redlining, right? And I didn't invent it, obviously. But if you take a 20th century U.S. history course, there's a really good possibility that redlining was going to come up even before Ta-Nehisi Coates discovered it in 2014. So there's something actually creepy about this whole framework of the recent realization of something that isn't a recent realization. Ben, I'm sorry I cut you off.
Oh, no, I was just going to say the realization is not recent, but what maybe has been popularized quite a bit in recent years is like a certain spin on those historical facts, where the lesson, and we saw this, you talk about this at the beginning toward freedom, that we saw this a lot in the 2016 election, when Hillary Clinton said, Bernie Sanders kept talking about breaking up the big banks, which is something I'd be mildly critical of. I think you should nationalize the big banks, but so that's a different discussion. But Hillary Clinton's objection to nationalizing to breaking up the big banks was, well, if you break up the big banks, that won't solve racism. And you had a very similar, like in the Ta-Nehisi Coates clip we just watched, like what he says at the end, like is very explicit about what he takes the moral of the story to be, that, that you can't, that the problem of, white supremacy, which ultimately Coates has argued, solved by reparations, or to the extent that it can be solved, as you say, like the whole point of original sin is that it's unsolvable and, it stays. But if it's solvable, it's solvable with something racially targeted like that. And that like universal social programs as a solution to racial disparities and poverty and economic inequality, and as solutions to poverty and economic inequality in general, are supposed to be like discredited by this history. Like that's the lesson. It's like, well, look, we and it's kind of weird actually, because like in this history, like the New Deal is being attacked correctly in some instances, although some of it is simplistic, as you say in the book. Like, you know, 3/4 of the people who were affected by these exclusions, you know, were not Black, but you know, when like the New Deal is being criticized correctly for not being universalist enough, you know, because it doesn't apply to everybody. But the conclusion that's being drawn from that is, therefore, universalism doesn't work, and you have to do something, you know, racially targeted instead. That, you know, you can't have like the Bernie Sanders agenda or anything more radical than that. That can't be the solution. The solution has to see like race as an ontological category as the problem.
But wasn't that the issue? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, but wasn't that the big kind of issue with his whole point, and then kind of falling down a rabbit hole of Rothstein's book, Color of Law? I mean, there's definitely several clips you can find of Coates and Richard Rothstein, and it seems like a lot of even his case for reparations is based off that book. And I'm not going to lie, there's actually a lot of aspects of Rothstein's book that I did like, because a lot of it takes place literally where I grew up, in Richmond, California. And it does help explain why the makeup of that city, you know, looks a certain way. But to leave out the whole agricultural aspect of the New Deal, which, you know, there's a great chapter in Towards Freedom where Touré really gets into that. What is it? Ta-Nehisi Coates and Barack Obama, the yin yang twins of neoliberalism. Am I saying that right?
Yeah. Yes. My favorite chapter title that I've ever.
And that's one of my favorite. I actually was re-looking it over today when I found out we were going to be talking about that book, and I really enjoyed that chapter, because it's an important part of the New Deal, because there is a lot of New Deal fetishism going on right now, I feel, on the quote unquote left. And the New Deal is somewhat complicated.
Yeah.
And there's nuances to the way we should look at it. It doesn't have to be all or nothing.
No,
and,
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, for sure. And I do want to get into some of those nuances and some of the historical story that Touré tells in Toward Freedom. But because we, in just a minute, we are going to go to switch to the post game. Before we end the main show, I was hoping, for the benefit of people who are not patrons and won't follow us there, that you could, since you use like this in that subtitle of Toward Freedom, you use this provocative phrase, race reductionism, which is not something that I think is in most people's vocabulary. If you're in like aware of certain kind of intra-left battles, you may have encountered the charge.
King of the blacks, you say it. Fucking no problem.
Well, I was told there wasn't one, so which is it? So like, so you might have heard, a lot of people might have heard of class reductionism before and what that's, supposedly is. But race reductionism is probably unfamiliar vocabulary. You want to take just a minute and cash that out a little bit?
Sure. You want me to do that now?
Yeah.
So I guess in order to understand what race reductionism is, you have to have some sense of what class reductionism is, right? Because I came up with the concept of race reductionism when reflecting on class reductionism. And I had thought for some time that what a class reductionist was someone who insisted that, racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., were basically either inconsequential to people's lives or secondary with respect to consequence. And what it all boiled down to was class, right? And I thought that for a while, that's what a class reductionist was, until I kept getting hit with the charge of being a class reductionist. And I'm sorry, racism, I understand to be real. I understand sexism to be real. I understand homophobia to be real. I have, from adolescence forward, at the very least, I have made cases for the need. I first understood the value of anti-discrimination policies. I understood that my parents were beneficiaries of it. That's how they had the good jobs that they had, and that's how they became homeowners. Go Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 68. I went to high school with some racist white kids. And had some Miss Morello or worse style racist white teachers. So that kind of made, and I occasionally walked through, middle class white ethnic neighborhoods that feared the presence of people who looked like me and had the cops called on me from time to time for not being in the right neighborhood. I was just walking home. Yep. So, life experience made plain to me that racism was real. And as a scholar, that's what, as a budding scholar, trying to understand racial inequality is why I majored, in American studies with a concentration in Black studies or Black history. When I was in college, that's why I went to grad school. I wanted to make sense of these things. So since I had, for all of my life that mattered, consistently made cases for the utility of anti-discrimination policies and the like, because I knew racism was real and consequential, and yet I was charged with being a class reductionist, I realized that characterization that I operated with, what a class reductionist wasn't really what people meant by it. And instead, what became apparent to me, and this is going to fast track us into what a race reductionist is. Instead, what was made apparent to me is that the problem that I presented in people like my dad or Cedric Johnson or Barbara Fields or fill in the blank, right? The other Black alleged class reductionists, is that we insist on following through on the logic of the social constructiveness of race, right? And if what race is, and there are a lot of debates about what race is, but if race is a social construct, then what that means, at least what I've understood it to mean, and what it seems to mean to me as a historian, is that race is a kind of ideological political project that was conceived. Notice I used the passive voice, but was conceived, 18th century or so forward, to basically reify, to treat as natural inequalities that were the product of human beings, right? I mean, colonialism, slavery, genocide are not, hurricanes. They're not forces of nature. They are the efforts of human beings. And to rationalize, and the 18th century is really important in this regard, but to rationalize, let's say, in the age of liberalism, right? The extermination of American Indians, or the enslavement of people of African descent. You don't have to rationalize that before liberalism, but because the European world and the African world and the Asian world were actually pretty brutal, right? In the era before liberalism. But in the era of liberalism, you do have to come up with some kind, if you're going to exterminate or enslave people, you have to come up with some sort of framework to explain why the rules of the democratic society don't apply to American Indians, or why the rules of the democratic society don't apply to people of African descent, why you can enslave them and profit off of them, or exterminate them and steal their land or whatever, right? And so again, race then if it's an ideological political project to treat as natural the inequalities that are the product of human beings rather than nature. And if that's your jumping off point, then what that means is that race cannot take on a life of its own, right? That racism can't, because no ideology can take on a life of its own, right? A demon could, right? This is the original sin, right? You can come up with an epigenetic take on racism, right? Racism's in our DNA, but all that stuff is race taking on a life of its own, and it's therefore no longer part of an ideological political project, right? At least it's no longer an ideological project, for sure, because it's its own independent force that operates, again, on its own terms, independent of society. And if you look at the history of race in America, that doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, racism certainly has been a thing, and it's been a force in American life as such, unambiguously, for centuries. There's no question about that. But the parameters of racial group inclusion, or what it means to be Black or American Indian, or there actually used to be a lot more white groups than there are today, right? In post-World War II, that changes, but there used to be lots of white others back in the day. So the parameters of the in-groups and out-groups have changed with time. And again, just to cut to the chase on this one, you couldn't have imagined 70 years ago that there would be black multimillionaire CEOs or even billionaire CEOs or a black president. And I literally lost money on the 2008 election. I could not have imagined that America would elect a black man, period, president, let alone one named Barack Hussein Obama, right? So, see, I was too cynical for my own good in 2008, apparently. But you can see, again, that it's not that it's taking on a life of its own. It's that race and its parameters have followed with the contours of American political economy, right? So anyway, what a race reductionist is someone then who imagines that race can operate independently of American political economy and that racial inequality has little to do with capitalism and everything to do with the demon that is race, right? Which has taken on a life of its own. And of course, there is this weird kind of, and you guys alluded to this previously, either or, right? I think that one of the things that's sort of vexing about taking the example of the New Deal as the inherent limitations of universalism is that, and this is in keeping with the basic point, that the parameters of race have changed. Well, of course, the New Deal in the 1930s was going to reflect the racial sensibilities of the era of eugenics, right? I mean, the Nazis didn't come up with their horrible ideology on their own. It wasn't just that there were a bunch of crazy Germans who got together and did crazy German stuff, but there was a Western movement, ideological movement known as eugenics that the U.S. and England had pioneered as part of their rationalizations for things like Jim Crow, let's say, and colonialism and the like, right? So, of course, in that era where racial sensibilities were not as pronounced in the 30s, racist sensibilities were not as pronounced in the 30s as they were, let's say, 10 or 20 years earlier for a variety of reasons, some of which are owed to the New Deal, actually. So there's some pluses to the racial sensibilities, at least owed in part to the New Deal. Mm-hmm. But the 1930s, racial sensibilities in the 1930s, and if you have grandparents, this is very easy to appreciate, or great-grandparents, were not as reflexively inclusive, we'll call it, as they would be today. And I just want to hammer away at this, if you'll indulge me with an abridged version of an anecdote. Two of my closest friends from adolescence into middle age were white ethnics, Italian American and Jewish, respectively. And I'll just say this: neither of them wanted me around their grandparents, and particularly the grandfathers. But the reality is, in one case, I won't say which one, that one didn't want me around either of the living grandparents because of the things that will come out of their mouths. And I've got good anecdotes that I'm not going to share, but that's a small window onto how the sensibilities had changed, right? Because for those people of the World War II or New Deal generation, they tended to reflex more in kind of racist sensibilities, right? Than, let's say, their boomer children or their Gen X grandchildren, right?
Yeah. Well, we can get more into this, and you can, for our patrons, you can spill the tea on all of the racist grandparents in the post game, which the patrons already have the link for. But so we'll definitely continue this discussion for a little while there. But link is also in the description, patreon.com/Ben Burgis. But yeah, so not that we're saying goodbye, because we're going to say hello again in like 90 seconds in the post game. But thank you guys for coming on. Thank you everybody who's not going to be joining us for that, for watching Left is Best.
Thanks.